San Francisco Bay, August 14th, 1945. Japan surrendered yesterday. Emperor Hirohito's voice had crackled through radio speakers across the Pacific, announcing the unthinkable. The war was over. But for 37 Japanese nurses standing on the deck of the USS Benevolence, staring at the Golden Gate Bridge, rising through the week like a monument to American power, the real battle was just beginning. They had been told Americans would execute them as war criminals, torture them for information, strip them of dignity before disposing of them like animals. The propaganda films shown during their training had been explicit. Americans bayoneting prisoners, Americans laughing while women screamed, Americans who viewed Japanese people as less than human as vermin to be exterminated. But when 23-year-old surgical nurse Keiko Matsuda stepped off that transport ship expecting bullets, she heard 5 words that would shatter everything she believed about the enemy. "Will you help us save lives?" The question hung in the salt air like smoke. Impossible. Incomprehensible. What would make an American doctor ask a Japanese enemy to operate on wounded American soldiers? What kind of nation would trust former enemies with the lives of their own sons? The answer would reveal a truth more powerful than any bomb that had ever been dropped. Keiko stood on that San Francisco dock, her white nursing uniform stained with 3 months of blood and dirt from the caves of Saipan. The fabric was stiff in places where blood had dried and never fully washed out. Dark brown patches marked where she had held dying men trying to stop bleeding with nothing but pressure and prayer. Behind her, 36 other Japanese women, some barely 20 years old, others with gray threading through their black hair, clutched small canvas bags containing everything they owned in the world. In front of her, American soldiers stood in loose formation. But their rifles hung casually over shoulders, barrels pointed at the ground. They did not aim them at the nurses. They did not shout orders or insults. They simply watched with faces that showed curiosity rather than hatred, professional interest rather than rage. One young private, perhaps 19 years old with freckles across his sunburned nose, even gave a small nod as the women passed, a gesture of acknowledgement, of recognition, as though seeing them as people rather than enemies. Keiko would later learn why that soldier, Private James Wilson, showed such unexpected kindness. His older brother had been a medic who died saving wounded Japanese civilians on Okinawa, refusing to leave an injured mother and her children even as American artillery advanced. Wilson had grown up hearing his brother talk about the oath to heal anyone regardless of nationality. That family legacy of mercy would echo through everything that was about to unfold. The contrast struck Keiko like a physical blow to the chest. She had expected execution chambers, dark rooms with bare light bulbs and blood-stained walls. Instead, she smelled antiseptic, hospital-grade disinfectant mixed with salt air and diesel fuel from the ships in the harbor. She had expected screams of torture, the sounds of violence and suffering. Instead, she heard distant sounds of cable cars clanging their bells as they climbed San Francisco's steep hills, car horns, honking in traffic, vendors calling out prices at the Fisherman's Wharf Market, ordinary American life continuing as though the world had not just torn itself apart in the most devastating war in human history. The Golden Gate Bridge gleamed in the morning light, its red-orange paint bright against the pale blue sky. Untouched. Perfect. A feat of engineering that spoke of resources and vision and a nation that could build beautiful things even while fighting wars on 2 fronts. Behind the Japanese nurses lay the smoking ruins of Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. Cities turned to ash and shadow, their populations scattered or dead, their infrastructure destroyed so completely that it would take generations to rebuild. Here the bridge stood as proof of what victory looked like. Abundance. Power. A nation that had fought a global war and still had enough left over to maintain their monuments and paint their bridges and feed their people. Keiko Matsuda had trained at Tokyo Imperial University Hospital before the military conscripted her 2 years ago. She had been one of the best in her class, top marks in surgical technique, steady hands that never trembled even during the most delicate procedures, clear mind under pressure that could prioritize and make life or death decisions in seconds. The kind of nurse who could assist in a complex operation for 12 hours straight and never lose focus, never make a mistake, never let exhaustion compromise her judgment. Her instructors had praised her, called her a natural, said she had the talent to become a surgeon herself if she wanted to pursue advanced training. Her father, a professor of classical literature at Kyoto University, had been so proud. Her mother, a master weaver of traditional silk textiles, had wept with joy at her graduation. Then the war came and turned her into something else entirely. Someone who had seen things no young woman should ever see. Men with their faces blown off by shrapnel, still conscious and screaming because the morphine had run out weeks ago. Soldiers dying of gangrene because there was no penicillin left anywhere in the entire Pacific Theater, their limbs turning black and rotting while they were still alive. Children caught in crossfire, their small bodies torn apart by bullets and bombs that did not distinguish between combatant and innocent. Her small medical bag, somehow kept through the chaos of capture, contained surgical instruments she had managed to protect through everything. A scalpel with a blade she had sharpened herself on smooth stones. Clamps that she had sterilized over and over until the metal had started to discolor. Scissors that no longer closed perfectly, but still worked well enough. A notebook with patient records written in her careful handwriting, each entry a testament to someone who had lived and died under her care. And most precious of all, a photograph of her family taken in Kyoto before the war. In the photograph, her father stood tall and dignified in his professor's robes, a slight smile on his scholarly face. Her mother sat beside him in a beautiful silk kimono. She had woven herself the pattern of cherry blossoms so delicate it looked like the flowers might blow away in a breeze. And her younger sister, Yuki, only 19 years old in the photo, smiled broadly in her wedding kimono, newly married to a young naval officer who had seemed so handsome and promising. Keiko had no idea if any of them were still alive. The last letter she had received from home, before communications from the Japanese home islands stopped completely, had been dated January 1945. Her mother had written that Kyoto had been spared the worst of the American bombing raids so far, that the ancient temples and cultural treasures were still standing, that her father was still teaching, though the university had very few students left. But that had been 8 months ago. Anything could have happened since then. Behind Keiko, Nurse Haruka Sato whispered in Japanese, her voice carefully modulated to keep it low enough that the American guards would not understand even if they spoke the language. This is the trick, Matsuda. They make us trust them with kindness, then they kill us when our guard is down. This is psychological warfare. Do not be fooled. Haruka had reasons for her bitterness that went beyond ordinary wartime propaganda. Her younger brother Kenji had died screaming on Iwo Jima. He had been only 17 years old, lied about his age to enlist, wanted to serve the emperor and prove his manhood. Shot through the stomach during the fighting, he had bled out slowly over 3 agonizing days because there were no medics left to help him, all of them already dead or too busy with other casualties. His last letter home, written in shaky handwriting as he slowly died in a cave while American forces advanced overhead, had described the pain, the unbearable thirst, the knowledge that he was dying alone and afraid and far from home. Haruka had memorized every word of that letter, had read it so many times the paper had nearly disintegrated. She would not forget. She would not forgive. Not ever. Keiko did not answer Haruka's warning. What could she say? That she hoped Haruka was wrong, that she wanted to believe the Americans might be different from what they had been taught. Such words would sound like weakness, or worse, like betrayal of everything they had fought for, everyone they had lost. The buses arrived in a convoy of 5 vehicles, military trucks with hard wooden benches and windows covered with metal mesh wire that let in air but prevented anyone from jumping out. The nurses climbed aboard in silence, their movements careful and controlled, still maintaining military discipline even in defeat. As the convoy pulled away from the dock and rumbled through San Francisco streets, Keiko pressed her face close to the wire mesh and stared at a world that seemed to come from another planet entirely. Grocery stores lined the streets with their windows displaying food in abundance that seemed impossible. Real food. Fresh food. Not the emergency rations and substitutes that Japan had been surviving on for years. Oranges piled in pyramids 6 feet high, their bright color almost painful to eyes accustomed to the drab browns and grays of wartime. Cuts of meat hanging from hooks in butcher shop windows, more meat visible in one store than Keiko had seen in the past year combined. Bread stacked on shelves in varieties she did not even know existed. White bread, wheat bread, sourdough bread, rye bread, most of it looking soft and fresh and abundant. Not the empty stores she remembered from Tokyo where citizens waited in lines for hours, sometimes all day, to receive a single handful of rice mixed with sawdust to make it go further. Not the desperate scramble for scraps that had become normal in Japan as the war dragged on and resources became scarcer. Here, food seemed to overflow from every shop, as though there was so much that Americans did not even know what to do with it all. Women in colorful dresses walked down sidewalks wearing reds and blues and yellows and greens. Not the drab khaki work uniforms that had become standard issue in Japan, as every scrap of fabric was diverted to military use. These American women wore clothes that served no purpose except to look beautiful. Clothes with no utilitarian function. Luxury in the middle of war. They carried shopping bags bulging with purchases. They smiled and laughed as they talked to each other. They looked well-fed, healthy, untouched by the kind of deprivation that had hollowed out Japanese civilians. Children laughed and shouted as they ran down the street, chasing each other in some game that involved a red rubber ball. Not thin and hollow-eyed like the children Keiko remembered from the final months before capture. Not searching through rubble for scraps of food or fuel. Not wearing clothes made from old rice sacks because there was no cloth left for children's garments. Just playing, being children, wasting energy on games and laughter as though calories were something abundant enough to spend on joy. Cars filled the streets in numbers that seemed fantastical. Automobiles of every size and color, some sleek and new-looking, others older but still functioning. So many cars that they created traffic jams at intersections, drivers honking horns impatiently at each other as though waiting a few extra minutes was the greatest inconvenience imaginable. In Tokyo, civilian vehicles had disappeared from the roads years ago. Every drop of gasoline went to the military. Every piece of metal was melted down for weapons and ammunition. Personal automobiles had become relics of a vanished age of peace and prosperity. But here Americans drove wherever they wanted, to work, to shops, to visit friends, as though gasoline was something they would never run out of, as though the war had not required them to sacrifice their personal convenience. Yumi Nakamura, 31 years old and a veteran nurse from the China campaign, sat pressed against Keiko on the hard wooden bench. Yumi had seen more death than most of the younger nurses, had treated casualties in Manchuria, where the fighting against Chinese forces had been brutal and supplies were almost non-existent even before the Pacific War began. Had learned to perform amputations with whatever tools she could find, sometimes using carpenter's saws when proper surgical equipment was unavailable. Had held dying men and lied to them about how they would recover, telling them their wounds were not serious, even as she watched them bleed out from injuries she had no way to treat. Yumi's face was drawn and pale as she stared out the mesh-covered window. "How can this be?" she whispered in Japanese, her voice carrying the confusion they all felt. "We bombed Pearl Harbor. We invaded their territories. We killed their soldiers and civilians. We started this war. Why does their country look completely untouched? Why do their people look like they have never known hunger or fear?" Sakura Ito, 20 years old and the youngest of the nurses, answered quietly from the seat directly behind them. Her voice trembled slightly, whether from fear or from the realization of what she was saying. Keiko could not tell. "Because we lost. Because we were lied to about everything. Because what our leaders told us about American weakness and desperation was propaganda designed to keep us fighting even when the war was already lost." Haruka Sato hissed from across the narrow aisle of the bus, her voice sharp with warning and barely controlled anger. "Don't say that. Don't ever say that. We fought for the emperor. We did our duty to Japan and to our ancestors. What we see here means nothing. It is just American wealth built on the backs of conquered peoples. It does not make us wrong or our cause unjust." But even Haruka, fierce and defiant as she was, could not fully explain away the impossible contradiction they were witnessing. Japan had sacrificed everything for this war, had sent its young men to die on foreign soil, most of them barely trained and poorly equipped, had starved its civilians to feed its army, implementing ration systems that left people perpetually hungry, had bombed its own cities rather than surrender them intact to the enemy, destroying homes and infrastructure in the name of fighting to the last man, had given up every comfort, every luxury, every hope of normal, peaceful life, all in service to the idea that victory would somehow justify all the suffering and sacrifice. In America looked like the war had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, Buildings stood intact, their windows unbroken, and their walls unmarked by bullets or shrapnel. Streets were clean and well-maintained, not cratered by bombs or littered with debris. People looked healthy and well-fed, not gaunt and desperate. Whatever Americans had given up to fight this global war, it clearly had not been everything. Not even close. The buses pulled up to Letterman General Hospital, a sprawling complex of white-painted buildings overlooking the bay. The architecture was clean and modern, built in the style Keiko had seen in photographs of American construction before the war. Multiple stories tall with large windows that would let in natural light. Well-maintained grounds with grass and trees. A flagpole flying the American flag, the stars and stripes snapping crisply in the breeze coming off the water. This would be their holding facility while American authorities decided what to do with them. Keiko stepped off the bus carefully, her legs unsteady after the long sea voyage and the bus ride. She looked up at the clean white walls, the windows gleaming in the afternoon sun, the American flag clearly visible against the blue sky. This is where it begins, she thought, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. This is where they will humiliate us, break us, make us pay for what our nation did to theirs. But when they entered the main building and were directed to the processing center, Keiko found something she had not expected. Medical examination rooms, real examination rooms with proper equipment, not interrogation chambers with harsh lights and restraints, clean white walls that had been recently painted, medical equipment that looked almost new, certainly newer, better, and better maintained than anything she had seen in Japan for the past 2 years. American nurses moved efficiently through the space, their white uniforms crisp and clean and perfectly pressed. Their faces showed professional detachment rather than hatred or cruelty. They spoke to each other in low voices, checking charts and preparing exam rooms, and going about their work with the kind of calm competence that came from having enough supplies and enough staff and enough time to do things properly. One by one, the Japanese nurses were called into examination rooms. Keiko waited her turn on a hard wooden bench in the hallway, her jaw clenched tight, her hands folded carefully in her lap to keep them from shaking visibly. She watched as Yumi went in before her, disappearing behind a white door marked with a red cross. Watched as Sakura emerged 10 minutes later, looking confused and shaken, her eyes red as though she had been crying. Watched as Haruka came out with her face set in hard lines, her expression determinedly neutral, refusing to show whatever emotions she might be feeling. Then her name was called. Nurse Matsuda. Through this door, please. Keiko stood on legs that felt unsteady, walked forward down the hallway that suddenly seemed very long, entered the examination room and found an American doctor waiting for her. He was perhaps 55 years old, gray hair cut short in military style, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light from the window. He wore a white doctor's coat over his military uniform, the coat spotlessly clean. A stethoscope was draped around his neck. His hands resting on the examination table looked steady and capable. Surgeon's hands? Hands that knew how to heal. Beside him stood a young Japanese-American woman who introduced herself with a small bow as Mary Chen, the translator. She was perhaps 28 years old, dressed in a simple civilian dress rather than a uniform. She had sad eyes that seemed to carry their own burden of loss and complicated loyalties. Her Japanese was fluent, but carried the slight accent of someone who had grown up speaking English as well. Later, Keiko would learn that Mary had been born in San Francisco, raised in a household that honored both cultures, and had spent the war years working at this hospital, while her own parents were held in an internment camp in the California desert. But for now, Mary was simply the voice that would convey the doctor's words. "Please sit down on the examination table," the doctor said through Mary, his voice calm and professional. "I am Dr. Robert Hayes, head of surgery here at Letterman General Hospital. We need to conduct a basic medical examination to check your health. Make sure you do not have tuberculosis or other infectious diseases that could spread to other patients or staff. This is standard procedure for all prisoners of war, regardless of nationality." All prisoners, Keiko thought, her mind catching on those words. Not just Japanese, this was protocol. Standard medical procedure applied equally. Dr. Hayes began the examination with practiced efficiency. He asked her to breathe deeply while he listened to her lungs with the stethoscope, the metal cold against her back, even through the thin fabric of her stained uniform. He checked her heartbeat, counting silently while watching a clock on the wall. He looked carefully at her hands and feet, noting the infected cuts that had not healed properly in the weeks since capture. He examined her eyes with a small light. He asked questions through Mary about pain symptoms, medical history. Through all of this, his touch was gentle, professional. He did not leer or make inappropriate comments. He did not handle her roughly or show disgust. He simply performed a thorough medical examination the way any competent doctor would. When he finished, he washed his hands carefully in a sink, then wrote something in a chart. He spoke to Mary, who translated. You are significantly malnourished and showing signs of several infections, including what appears to be cellulitis in the wounds on your feet. We will treat these conditions. You will receive antibiotics and proper nutrition. The infection should clear up within a week or two, with treatment. Keiko felt tears prick her eyes but forced them back through sheer willpower. She would not cry in front of the enemy. She simply nodded once and left the room, her mind reeling. Antibiotics, real antibiotics, medicine she had watched men die for lack of. And here Americans were offering it to prisoners, to enemies. After all the examinations were completed, the nurses were led down another hallway to shower facilities. Keiko followed with dread building in her chest. She had expected cold buckets of water, humiliation, perhaps worse. The propaganda films had been explicit about what happened to women who fell into enemy hands. Instead, she found herself in a large, clean tile room with multiple shower stalls lining both walls. Each stall had a plastic curtain that could be pulled closed for privacy. Privacy. In a prisoner of war processing center, the concept seemed impossible. An American Red Cross volunteer, a middle-aged woman with gray streaks running through her brown hair, and a kind face demonstrated through Mary how the showers worked. She turned a knob and water began flowing. She adjusted another knob, and steam rose as the water heated. Hot water was available. They could take as long as needed. No one would rush them or watch. On wooden benches sat neat stacks of thick white towels and bars of soap. Not harsh lye soap. Real soap. White and smooth and smelling faintly of lavender. Keiko picked up a bar with trembling hands. The scent brought tears to her eyes immediately. She had not smelled anything so clean, so pure, so utterly civilian in over a year. Lavender reminded her of home, of her mother's garden. She entered a stall and pulled the curtain closed. For a moment she just stood there, breathing hard. Then she turned the knob marked with the letter H. Hot water poured from the showerhead. Steam rose in clouds. The temperature was perfect. Keiko gasped out loud. Then she began to cry. She could not help it. The water ran over her skin, washing away weeks of filth. She picked up the lavender soap and worked it between her hands. Around her in other stalls, she could hear similar sounds. Women weeping, women laughing in disbelief, the rush of water mixing with voices. In the next stall, Yumi spoke quietly. This is not right, Matsuda. They should be punishing us. What game are they playing? Keiko scrubbed at her arms with the soft soap. I don't think it's a game, Nakamura. I think this is simply how they do things. The realization frightened her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she understood, but this kindness, this unexpected dignity, suggested something more complicated, something that did not fit into simple categories of friend and enemy. She washed her hair 3 times, scrubbed her skin until it was pink, let the hot water run over her shoulders until muscles that had been tense for weeks finally began to unclench. When she finally emerged wrapped in one of the thick white towels, she caught sight of herself in a mirror. She barely recognized the face looking back. Clean skin, wet hair, eyes that looked merely tired instead of dead. She looked human again. After showering, they were given fresh clothes, simple cotton dresses, and comfortable shoes. Everything was clean and whole, without patches or holes or bloodstains. Then they were led to a dining hall that smelled of food. Real food. Hot food. The scent hit them like a physical force. Several women actually stopped walking, completely overwhelmed. The dining hall was large with long tables and chairs. American hospital staff moved through serving food. The nurses lined up their hands shaking as they accepted plates loaded with scrambled eggs, toast with butter slices of ham, fresh fruit, cups of real coffee. Keiko stared at her plate. She had not seen this much food in one meal in over a year. She sat at a table with Yumi and several others. All of them stared in disbelief. Is it poisoned? Someone whispered. Yumi nodded toward the kitchen staff eating the same food. If poisoned, they poisoned themselves. Keiko picked up her fork. Her hand trembled as she cut a small piece of eggs and brought it to her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue. rich, creamy. She closed her eyes and a tear rolled down her cheek. Around the table, others began to eat. Some wept openly, others ate in silence, their faces showing the conflict raging inside them. Sakura whispered, "My brother died on Iwo Jima. He starved to death in a cave. And here I sit eating butter and ham from the enemy who killed him." "What am I?" Yumi answered quietly. "It makes you alive. It makes you human." And maybe that is what we were supposed to forget. But what broke Keiko was the orange. A whole perfect orange sitting on her tray. In Japan, oranges were luxuries. She had not seen fresh fruit in 2 years. She picked it up with both hands, peeled it slowly. The citrus scent exploded into the air. She separated a segment and put it in her mouth. The sweetness was almost painful. Juice ran down her chin. "How can they have so much?" someone whispered. "This is not weakness," another answered. "This is power. They have so much they can give oranges to prisoners." The observation settled over the table. It was true. If America had this abundance, then what else had been a lie? That evening they were given sleeping quarters. Real beds with mattresses and pillows. 2 blankets each. Keiko lay in her bed clean and fed, trying to make sense of the day. In the darkness, Haruka's voice came. "Do you remember what they told us, that Americans were beasts who would rape and murder us?" Yumi answered, "I remember. But today they gave us soap and butter and oranges," Haruka said, voice sharp. "And some of you are already forgetting who you are, already becoming soft." Keiko knew Haruka was looking at her in the darkness. She kept her eyes closed. Tomorrow would bring more revelations. Tomorrow, Dr. Hayes would make an offer that would force her to choose. Morning came with a bugle call at 6. After breakfast, an officer addressed them through Mary. "You will be given work assignments. You are prisoners of war under Geneva Convention. You will be fed, clothed, given medical care. You will work but be paid wages. You will write letters home. You will not be mistreated. Paid for labor. Letters home." This was not captivity as Keiko had imagined it. Most nurses were assigned to simple tasks, laundry, kitchen duty. Keiko was assigned to the laundry initially. She stood in a steamy room folding sheets, her hands moving automatically while her mind wandered. The work gave her too much time to think. Time to remember the men she had failed to save. Time to wonder if her family was alive. Time to question everything she thought she knew. On the third day, something changed. Dr. Robert Hayes approached her while she was folding sheets. Mary Chen followed a step behind. Through Mary, Hayes said, "I understand you were trained as a surgical nurse at Tokyo Imperial University. Is that correct?" Keiko froze. "Yes, I assisted in surgical procedures for 2 years before conscription." Hayes nodded. "We are understaffed. Wounded soldiers arriving every day from the Pacific Theater. Some need immediate surgery to survive. I would like to ask if you and some of the other trained nurses would be willing to assist in the surgical ward." "Ask." "Not order, ask." Keiko stared at him. He was asking her to save American lives. "I will do it," she heard herself say. Hayes smiled. "Thank you, Nurse Matsuda. Report to the surgical ward tomorrow morning at 7. That night, Keiko told the others. Several had surgical experience. Yumi, Sakura, 2 others. Haruka exploded. "They want us to save American lives, men who fought against our country." Keiko kept her voice steady. "We are nurses. We took an oath to heal. We took an oath to the Emperor first." Haruka's voice rose. "I will not let wounded men die just to prove I am still Japanese." Haruka stepped close. "When we return to Japan, you will be judged, and I will make sure everyone knows what you did here." The threat hung in the air. "Then I will be judged. But I will not refuse to save lives." Yumi stepped between them. "Enough. This is not a decision we can make for each other." That night, Keiko lay awake. Tomorrow she would enter an American operating room. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether she was a nurse first or a Japanese woman first. She already knew the answer. The next morning, Keiko and 5 other nurses reported to the surgical ward. They were given surgical scrubs and shown to a locker room. When they emerged, they looked like nurses again. Not prisoners. Hayes gathered them. "You will assist in surgeries. You will hand instruments, manage supplies, help with patient positioning. The work will be difficult. Many are badly wounded. But every life we save is a life saved. That is all that matters in this room. Not nationality, not politics, just life and death." Keiko felt the weight of his words. In this room, you are healers first. Everything else is secondary. The first surgery began 30 minutes later. A young Marine, maybe 20, with severe abdominal wounds. His name was Private James Sullivan, from Boston. His chart noted his next of kin, mother Patricia Sullivan, younger sister Margaret, age 16. Real people who would grieve if he died. Keiko stood beside Dr. Hayes, her hands steady as she passed him instruments. Scalpel, clamps, sutures. The familiar rhythm took over. For those hours, she was not a prisoner, simply a nurse doing her job. But beneath that professional calm, her mind churned. This boy's blood was on her gloves. If she saved him, he might fight in another war. But then she looked at his face. Young, pale, someone's son. War turned people into abstractions, but surgery made them human again. The surgery lasted 4 hours. When Sullivan was stable, Dr. Hayes looked at Keiko. Good work. You have excellent technique. Thank you, Keiko replied. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged her skills. Over the following days and weeks, Keiko and the other Japanese nurses became regular members of the surgical team. In the operating room, competence mattered more than nationality. But late at night, Keiko wrestled with impossible questions. She was saving the lives of men who had fought against her country. Was that betrayal? She thought of Private Sullivan, now recovering. She had seen him writing to his mother. When he saw her, he smiled and said something. Mary translated later. Thank you. That young man might go on to have a family, and she had helped make that possible. How could that be wrong? But then she thought of Japanese soldiers she had treated. Boys who died because there was no medicine. Why did they have to die while Americans lived? Yumi put it into words one night. They did not win because they were braver. They won because they had more. More factories, more food, more medicine. We were told spirit would overcome material advantage, but spirit does not stop shrapnel. We sent boys to die with nothing but spirit, and they died because spirit is not enough. On Saturday afternoons, the hospital held a canteen where prisoners could spend their wages. The first time Keiko walked in, she stood frozen, staring at shelves of chocolate bars, cigarette soap, writing paper magazines. Luxuries that had disappeared from Japan years ago. Keiko used her first wages to buy a chocolate bar and writing paper. That night, she bit into the chocolate. The sweetness exploded on her tongue. She closed her eyes and tears ran down her face. It was too much. The kindness was too much. Each small mercy was a knife cutting away at the fortress of hatred she had built to survive. She tried to write a letter home but could not find words. How could she tell them she ate better than they did before the war? The guilt was overwhelming. She eventually wrote brief, bland words. I am alive and in American custody. I hope you are well. I love you. She never received a reply to that letter, would not receive any word for months. 2 weeks after she began working in the surgical ward, something happened that brought the American perspective into sharp focus. Keiko was walking back from the operating room when a man stepped into her path. You! His voice was thick with rage. An American soldier, perhaps 35, with sergeant stripes. She could smell alcohol on his breath. Sergeant Paul Morrison. My brother David died on Saipan. Morrison said, words slurred. 19 years old, he was a medic. Just like you. He grabbed her shoulders. Keiko froze. He died because you people had no medicine. He could have been saved. I am sorry, Keiko whispered. Sorry my brother died screaming, and you say sorry. He raised his fist. Keiko closed her eyes. Then another voice cut through. Sergeant Morrison, step back. Dr. Robert Hayes appeared. His voice carried authority. Morrison turned. Sir, these Japs killed my brother. They are prisoners under Geneva Convention protection. Under my protection. Morrison's face twisted. But sir, my brother. I know, Hayes said, voice softening. I lost my son too. Daniel died at Saipan. He was 22. Morrison stared shocked. I know what it is to wake up every morning and remember he's gone. I know what it is to see his empty chair at the dinner table. But we do not take revenge on prisoners. We follow the rules even when it hurts. That is what separates us from the enemy, command that sent these women into war with no supplies. That is what separates us from officers who told their soldiers to commit suicide rather than surrender. Morrison's fist slowly lowered. We choose protocol over emotion. We choose law over rage. We choose to be better than our worst impulses. That is American honor, John. That is who we are. That is what our sons and brothers died defending. Morrison collapsed into a chair. Great sobs shook his body. Hayes sat beside him, did not speak, just sat there and let Morrison cry. Keiko stood trembling. She realized something. American pain was real too. These people had lost sons and brothers. The fact that they chose mercy instead was not weakness. It was a kind of strength she had never encountered. Strength that came not from domination, but from restraint. That evening, Keiko told the others what happened. Haruka's face was dark. You see, they hate us. That sergeant wanted to kill you. But Yumi shook her head. He wanted to kill her, yes. But he didn't. Dr. Hayes stopped him, not with force, with principle, with the argument that rules matter more than feelings. That is not weakness. That is strength we were never taught to recognize. Haruka stood abruptly. You are all becoming traitors. She walked away. 3 months into captivity, something happened that forced Keiko to confront her questions directly. A severely wounded Japanese soldier was brought into the hospital. Lieutenant Takeshi Ono, 25 years old, captured on an outlying island barely alive. His body was torn apart by infected shrapnel wounds and malnutrition. The American doctors immediately began working to save him, treated him with the same care they gave their own soldiers. Real medicine, real surgery, the same resources regardless of nationality. Keiko was assigned to his care after the initial surgery. When he woke disoriented and in pain, she was sitting beside his bed. He looked at her, recognized her Japanese face, and began to weep uncontrollably. They saved me, he said in Japanese, his voice breaking. Why did they save me? I was supposed to die. Fight to the death. Never surrender, but I was unconscious when they found me. I woke up here, alive, because the enemy showed mercy. He turned his face to the wall. What am I supposed to do with that? I supposed to return home without this knowledge? Keiko had no answers. She simply held his hand as he cried. Over the following days, as Lieutenant Ono recovered, they talked quietly about the war and what it had done to them, about the propaganda they had believed and the reality they had found. One afternoon, Ono said something that would stay with Keiko. Maybe their greatest weapon was not the atomic bomb. It was refusing to dehumanize us. They saved me when they could have let me die. Now I can never hate them the way I was taught. They broke something in me. Not with cruelty, with kindness. And I do not know how to live with that. Keiko understood. She felt it too. The breaking, the reshaping, the terrible realization that everything you believed might be wrong. That was the real victory, not the bombs that destroyed cities, but the mercy that destroyed certainty. December brought cold mornings, 4 months since their arrival, 4 months of working in American hospitals eating American food, 4 months of slowly changing. Keiko had assisted in 20 surgical procedures. Each name was written in a small notebook she kept hidden. Private Sullivan, Corporal Jackson, Lieutenant Williams, real names, real people, real lives that continued because she had chosen to save them. But December also brought the letter she had been dreading. It arrived on a Tuesday, thin paper, her mother's shaky handwriting. Keiko took it to the bathroom and locked herself in a stall before opening it. The words were brief, factual, emotionless in the way that grief too deep for expression often is. Your father died in the firebombing of March. He was trying to save books from the university library. The building collapsed. We could not recover his body. Your sister Yuki is a widow. Her husband was killed at Okinawa. She has 2 children now. A boy, 3 years old. A girl, 14 months. She has no way to feed them. The children cry from hunger. I give them my portion, but it is not enough. We live in a shelter made from tin sheets and salvaged wood. I am glad you are alive, my daughter, but I do not know how much longer we will survive. Come home if you can. We need you. Keiko read the letter 3 times. Then she bent forward and vomited into the toilet. Father was dead. The professor who had taught her to love learning, who had read poetry to her as a child. Dead, crushed beneath burning books. Yuki was a widow with 2 starving children. The baby sister who had been so excited about marriage. Now alone, struggling to feed her babies while Keiko sat in an American hospital eating 3 meals a day. The guilt crashed over her like a physical wave. Yumi found her 20 minutes later, still sitting there. "What is it?" Keiko handed her the letter. Yumi read it, her face growing pale. "I received a similar letter last week. My parents are dead. My brother is missing. My hometown no longer exists." They sat together in silence for a long time. That evening, several other nurses shared their letters. All similar. Death, destruction, starvation. Their families were dying while they lived in relative comfort. The collective crisis settled over the dormitory like heavy fog. Haruka stood in the center of the room, her face triumphant in a bitter way. "You see now, this is why you should not help them. They have abundance while our families die. Every American you save is betrayal." But Keiko, surprising herself, stood to face her. "Refusing to save lives will not rebuild Tokyo. It will not feed my sister's children. It will not bring back my father or your brother or any of the dead. What will it accomplish then? It accomplishes this. It proves we are still human, still capable of seeing past politics to the individual, still able to choose healing over hatred. And maybe that matters more than you think." Haruka lunged forward. Others caught her. "You have forgotten who you are." Traitor guards came. Order was restored, but the division had become a chasm. That night, Keiko could not sleep. She got up and walked to the window, looked out at San Francisco lights. She thought about the 20 procedures she had assisted. Private Sullivan was home in Boston. Corporal Jackson had written thanking her. All these futures existed because she chose to help. Was that betrayal or something that transcended simple categories? She did not know, but she knew she could not stop, could not let wounded men die. That would make her a monster. In February of 1946, 6 months into captivity, Dr. Hayes called Keiko to his office. She went nervously. "Nurse Matsuda, I need to ask you something difficult," Hayes began. Keiko's heart raced. "I have a patient, Lieutenant David Martinez, 22 years old, from Houston, Texas. Severe internal injuries from a training accident. He needs immediate surgery or he will die." He paused. "The problem is that my hands have developed a tremor. Age and stress. This operation requires extremely delicate work. One wrong move and he dies. I need someone with steadier hands." He looked directly at her. "I want you to perform the surgery, not assist. Perform. I will supervise and guide, but I need your hands." Keiko felt the world tilt. He was asking her, a Japanese prisoner, to perform surgery on an American soldier. Not just assist, actually operate. "Me? But I am a skilled surgeon. That is all that matters. I have watched you work for 6 months. You have excellent technique, steady hands, good judgment. This soldier's best chance of survival is if you perform the critical portions. What if I fail? What if he dies?" Hayes leaned back. "Then he dies having had the best chance we could give him. But I trust your skills. The question is whether you trust yourself." Keiko sat in silence. Her mind raced. If she succeeded, she would have saved an American life with her own hands. If she failed, an American mother would lose her son. Either way, she would cross a line she could never uncross. That evening, she told the others. The dormitory erupted. Haruka was on her feet immediately. "If you do this, you become a traitor forever. Not just assisting, actually operating. How will you live with that?" But Yumi spoke up. "What line between healer and killer? She is choosing to heal. That is honor," Sakura added quietly. "My brother died because Japanese doctors had no supplies. If an American doctor had been there, would I have wanted him to refuse to help just because my brother was Japanese? No. I would have begged him to save my brother's life." The debate raged. Finally, Keiko stood. "I took an oath when I became a nurse. First, do no harm. That oath was not to Japan or America. It was to life itself. Tomorrow, I will go into that operating room. I will hold a scalpel. I will cut into an American soldier's body, and I will use every bit of my training to save his life. Not because I am American, not because I stopped being Japanese, but because I am a healer. And that is the truest thing I have ever been." Haruka spat on the floor. "When we return to Japan, you will pay for this. I will make sure everyone knows. Then I will pay, but I will not regret it." She did not sleep that night, lay awake thinking about Lieutenant Martinez, 22 years old, from Houston. The chart said he had a wife named Sarah, a 4-month-old daughter named Maria whom he had never met. Tomorrow his life would rest in her hands. Morning came too quickly. Keiko rose at 5, showered carefully, scrubbed her hands and arms until the skin was pink, dressed in surgical scrubs, looked at herself in the mirror and saw not a prisoner, just a surgeon preparing to do her work. At 7, she entered the surgical ward. The team was assembled. Dr. Hayes, 2 American nurses, an anesthesiologist, Mary Chen in the corner. Hayes introduced her formally. This is Nurse Keiko Matsuda. She will be performing the primary surgical procedures today. I will supervise. Her credentials are excellent and her surgical skills are exceptional. I expect you all to assist her with the same professionalism you would show to any surgeon. The American nurses nodded, though Keiko could see doubt in their eyes. Lieutenant Martinez was already on the table. Unconscious, intubated. So young, his face unlined, peaceful. Keiko looked at his chart one more time. Wife Sarah, daughter Maria, family in Houston, dreams of opening a ranch. A whole life waiting to be lived. If she failed, all of that would end here. She stepped to the table. An American nurse handed her a scalpel. The weight felt familiar. Right, Hayes stood beside her. Take your time, Nurse Matsuda. Trust your training. You know what needs to be done. Keiko positioned the scalpel, took a deep breath, and began. The first incision was clean, precise. Blood welled and was suctioned away. She worked methodically, exposing damaged tissue, identifying the source of bleeding. Her hands moved with confidence. Clamp here, Hayes said quietly. Good. Now isolate that vessel. Excellent. You see the tear? I see it. Can you repair it? Keiko studied the damaged artery. It was in a difficult location. One wrong move and she could cause more damage. But she had done this before. Yes, I can repair it. Then do it. I trust you. Those words. I trust you. From an enemy doctor to an enemy nurse. Across all the barriers of war and hatred. I trust you. Keiko's hands did not shake. She worked for 7 hours repairing damage, controlling bleeding and suturing torn tissue. Hayes guided when needed, but mostly just watched, confirming she was doing everything right. The critical moment came when she had to clamp a major vessel while simultaneously suturing a tear in the intestinal wall. Too much pressure, and the vessel would rupture. Not enough, and Martinez would bleed out. The timing had to be perfect. She positioned the clamp, adjusted the pressure, applied the first suture while holding her breath. The second, the third, the vessel held. The bleeding stopped. Hayes made a small sound of approval. Beautiful work, Nurse Matsuda. 2 hours later, they were closing. Martinez's vitals were stable. The repairs were holding. He was going to live. When the final suture was placed, Keiko stepped back. Her entire body was shaking, adrenaline crash hitting her. Hayes removed his mask and smiled. Excellent work. You saved his life today. Not me. You. Keiko removed her mask. Tears streamed down her face. In that operating room for those 7 hours, nationality had ceased to exist. Only surgeon and patient. Life and death. This was the truest thing she had ever done. Not because she was Japanese or American, but because she was a healer. And healing transcended every border. She walked out and found Yumi waiting. Yumi opened her arms. Keiko fell into them and wept. I saved him. I saved his life. I know. I am proud of you. Over the next 3 days, Keiko checked on Lieutenant Martinez regularly, watched his vitals improve, saw color return to his face. On the 3rd day, he was conscious enough to speak. Mary translated. The doctor told me you performed my surgery, that you saved my life. Keiko nodded. I want to thank you. My wife, Sarah, she has our baby girl, Maria, 4 months old. I've never met her, but because of you, I will. Because of what you did, I get to be a father. He reached out his hand. Keiko took it. Thank you for seeing me as a person. Not as an enemy, just as a person who wanted to live. You are welcome. Hope you have a long and happy life with your family. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. Sergeant Morrison approached Keiko in the corridor. She tensed, but Morrison was sober now. His face was calm. Nurse Matsuda, may I speak with you? Keiko nodded cautiously. Mary appeared. I heard you saved Lieutenant Martinez's life, that you performed the surgery yourself. He paused. My brother David was a medic, like you. When I heard what you did, I realized David would have done the same. If there had been a wounded Japanese soldier in front of him, he would have saved that soldier's life, because that is what healers do. Morrison pulled something from his pocket, a small photograph worn at the edges. This was David, 19 years old. He wanted to be a doctor after the war. He held out the photograph. Keep it. Remember that there were people on both sides trying to preserve life, not take it. Keiko looked down at young David Morrison smiling in his medic uniform, forever 19. Thank you, I will keep this, and I will remember. Morrison nodded and walked away. Keiko stood holding the photograph and understood something profound. The war had not been between Japanese and Americans. It had been between those who valued life and those who valued victory. She had chosen her side. In late February of 1946, the announcement came. Repatriation would begin in March. Ships were being prepared. Women and civilians would be given priority. The 37 nurses would be among the first groups to leave. The news should have brought joy. Instead, it brought dread. What home? Sakura asked. Tokyo is rubble. Our families are starving. We will go from eating 3 meals a day to wondering if we will eat at all. Yumi added. Keiko said nothing. She was thinking about the 23 American lives she had saved through surgery. That number would follow her back to Japan, would be used against her. But she could not regret it, would not regret it. On the day before departure, Dr. Hayes called Keiko to his office one last time. He handed her an envelope. This is a letter of recommendation. It details your surgical training and the work you did here. If you ever need employment references, show this to potential employers. Keiko took the envelope with trembling hands. Thank you, Dr. Hayes, for everything, for trusting me, for seeing me as a nurse, not just as an enemy. Hayes smiled. You were never an enemy to me, Nurse Matsuda. You were a colleague, one of the finest nurses I have ever worked with. He paused. I lost my son on Saipan, the same island where you were captured. For a long time, I hated every Japanese person. But working with you these past months has taught me something. My son died fighting for American values, like the Geneva Convention, like treating prisoners with dignity. If I had mistreated you, I would have dishonored everything he died for. But by treating you with respect, I honored his sacrifice. Keiko felt tears running down her face. Thank you for telling me that. And I am sorry for your loss. I know you are, just as I am sorry for yours. They stood together in silence, two people on opposite sides of a war united by their shared calling to heal. The ships departed on a cold March morning. Keiko stood on the deck watching San Francisco Bay recede. The Golden Gate Bridge grew smaller. Letterman Hospital disappeared into fog. Beside her, Yumi was also watching. Sakura wept. Haruka stood apart, her face set in hard lines. In her bag, carefully protected, Keiko carried 3 objects. The bar of lavender soap from her first shower, never used, kept as reminder of unexpected mercy. The photograph of David Morrison in his medic uniform, a symbol of shared purpose across enemy lines. And Dr. Hayes's letter of recommendation, proof that enemies could become colleagues. These small objects carried more meaning than any medal. They were evidence that even in humanity's darkest moments, there were those who chose mercy over vengeance. The ship cut through gray waters, carrying 37 Japanese nurses back to a homeland that no longer existed, back to families who would not understand, back to a society that would judge them for surviving. But Keiko stood on that deck with her hand touching the envelope and felt something unexpected. Not shame, not regret, but quiet pride. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had saved enemy lives with her own hands, had chosen healing over hatred, and she would do it again. The journey took 2 weeks. When they approached Yokohama, Keiko watched the coastline appear. What had once been vibrant urban centers were now wastelands of broken concrete and twisted metal. When they disembarked, Japanese officials processed them with bureaucratic efficiency. Did you cooperate with the enemy? Yes, Keiko answered honestly. I worked in their hospital. I helped save American lives. The official's face showed disapproval, but he stamped her papers. Keiko made her way to Kyoto, traveling through a landscape of destruction. The journey took 3 days. When she found her mother's shelter, a lean-to made of salvaged materials, she barely recognized the woman who emerged. Her mother had aged decades, thin, gaunt hair completely gray. But when she saw Keiko, she wept and pulled her into an embrace. You survived. Thank the ancestors. But when her mother asked about her time as prisoner, Keiko found she could not tell the truth. So she simply said, I survived, mother. That is all that matters. Keiko met her sister Yuki, widowed, two children ages 3 and 1, living in a bombed-out building. The children were thin, malnourished. A week after return, Keiko sought work at a local clinic. She was rejected. We heard you collaborated with Americans. We don't hire traitors. Haruka had spread the word, but she found a small operation run by Dr. Ishikawa, an elderly doctor who had lost his family. Can you save lives, he asked. Yes. Then you're hired. Keiko worked in primitive conditions, few supplies, little medicine. But she used techniques learned at Letterman. In 1949, she married Dr. Ishikawa's son Hiroshi. He knew her story. You did what healers do. I'm proud of you. They had 3 daughters. Keiko never told them the full story. It was too complicated. But she kept her 3 treasures hidden. Then in spring of 1952, 7 years after the war, a letter arrived from America. Dr. Hayes. He had tracked her. I have never forgotten the skill and dedication you showed. You were one of the finest nurses I ever worked with. I have told your story many times how Japanese prisoners helped save American lives not because forced, but because they were healers. The world needs more people like you. Keiko wept reading it. She wrote back. They corresponded until Hayes died in 1989. The years passed. Japan rebuilt. In 1985, 40 years after the war, Keiko finally told her daughters and grandchildren the full story. Her granddaughter Emily, 16 and hoping to study medicine, asked, Grandmother, were you a traitor? Keiko thought carefully. I was a healer. The Americans asked me to save lives, and I agreed because saving lives is what healers do. The Americans understood that every life has value, that following rules, even when difficult, separates civilization from barbarism. She showed Emily the 3 objects. If showing mercy makes me a traitor, then I suppose I am. But I think it makes me something better. It makes me human. A healer who honored her oath. Emily listened. What did it cost you? Everything and nothing. It cost me reputation among some. But it cost me nothing essential. Because if I had refused, then I would have lost my soul. The soap represents mercy I received. The photograph represents shared calling that transcends borders. The letter represents validation I needed. And it taught me that mercy is harder to carry than hatred, but it's the only thing that really lasts. Hatred burns out. But mercy builds bridges. Mercy changes the world in ways bombs never can. Emily held the objects. I want to be a doctor. I want to save lives the way you did. Keiko smiled. Then honor your oath. Always, even when difficult. Remember that your primary identity is healer. And remember that every patient is someone's loved one. In 2005, Keiko lay dying at age 83. Her family gathered around. Emily, now a successful physician, held her grandmother's hand. The 3 precious objects sat on the bedside table. Is there anything you want to say? Emily asked. Keiko gathered strength. Tell them. In 1945, I was asked a simple question. Will you help us save lives? And I said yes. That one word defined everything else. Not because I stopped being Japanese, but because I understood that healing is bigger than politics. That mercy is stronger than hatred. That we are all human. Tell them that the scalpel I held was more powerful than any weapon. That the choice to save lives mattered more than any battle. That the 23 American soldiers I helped save went home to their families. Tell them that mercy is the hardest burden, but the only one worth the wait. That hatred burns out, but kindness endures. That I am proud of the choice I made, proud that I honored my oath. That is my legacy. Those were Keiko's final words. She died peacefully 3 hours later. At her funeral, Emily told the story her grandmother had carried for 60 years. She held up the 3 objects. This soap represents mercy she received. This photograph represents shared calling that transcends borders. This letter represents validation she needed. My grandmother taught me that the hardest truths are the most important, that choosing to heal when you could choose to harm is the truest form of honor, that we are all simply human. The 3 objects were donated to a museum in Kyoto. They sit in a glass case now, the soap still wrapped, the photograph of David Morrison smiling forever, the letter from Hayes where it's still clear. A placard explains these objects belong to Keiko Matsuda Nakamura, a Japanese surgical nurse who chose to assist in surgical procedures on American soldiers during her captivity. Her choice was controversial. She viewed it as honoring her oath as a healer. Her story reminds us that even in war's darkest hours, there are those who choose healing over hatred. Visitors stop to read and study the objects. Some weep, others stand in silence. Because the story these objects tell is worth remembering. The story of how one woman faced with an impossible choice chose to be a healer first, and how that choice echoed across decades, proving that mercy multiplies in ways violence never can. This is the story of Keiko Matsuda Nakamura. This is the story of the scalpel and the truth. This is the story of what it means to choose humanity when every force pushes toward hatred. May it make a difference. May it change hearts. May it remind us all that we are human first. That mercy is strength. That healing matters more than vengeance. That seeing our enemies as human is the bravest choice we can make. This is the truth. This is what happened. This is what it meant and means still. Remember it, honor it, live it forward.